You have spent your entire life searching for the crime you committed. You will never find it. Jung mapped the exact process behind the hostility you could never trace to a cause. A process so uncomfortable that the people who need it most will make sure they never hear it. You sit across from someone you have never wronged, and the resentment is already in the room before a word is spoken. You have been running this investigation for years. There was never anything to find. You are obsessed with fairness. That is the first thing to understand about you. When someone withdraws their warmth, when a colleague suddenly shifts their tone, when a family member treats you with that specific cold distance that has no identifiable origin, your first reflex is not anger, it is investigation. You turn inward, you open the case file on yourself, and you begin searching for the error. He adjusts his behavior at work, becomes more accommodating, speaks less directly, offers more warmth than the situation requires, and watches the other person's face for signs that the hostility has eased. It has not. He rethinks the way he phrased a comment in a meeting 3 days ago. He wonders if his directness, the quality his closest friends value, registers as aggression to the people who cannot meet it. He pulls back further. The resentment does not pull back with him. She replays the dinner conversation, reviews whether her observation about the friend's situation came across as judgmental, softens her tone in the next interaction. She apologizes for something she cannot specifically name, just to release the tension. The tension remains. She considers whether she is too perceptive, too quick to notice what others are hiding, and whether that quickness reads as a kind of confrontation she never intended. She adjusts again. She makes herself smaller, and the people who resented her when she was large resent her equally when she is small. You've been solving the wrong equation your entire life, and the exhaustion of that effort is not ordinary tiredness. It is the bone-level fatigue of a person who has been performing a kind of emotional labor that no one around them can see. You are not simply navigating a social situation. You are conducting a perpetual internal audit, running diagnostics on your own personality in real time, adjusting variables that were never broken, testing hypotheses about your own inadequacy that were handed to you by people who never examined themselves for a single afternoon. The ego demands causality. That is its fundamental operating principle. If there is an effect, there must be a cause. If you are receiving hostility, you must have generated it. This assumption feels so rational, so obviously correct, that questioning it has never occurred to you. You assume the forensic autopsy would eventually produce evidence, that if you reviewed enough conversations, corrected enough behaviors, softened enough edges, you would finally locate the flaw that was generating the resentment. You treated the hostility like a math problem, and you were certain that if you just kept working the equation, the answer would eventually appear. Jung understood something that your ego will resist with considerable force. The deepest human reactions are not causal. They do not follow the clean logic of action and consequence. The coldness you are receiving has no root in your behavior. There is no crime in the case file because no crime was committed. The autopsy was never going to produce a verdict because there was never a body. You cannot fix this dynamic because you did not break it. And the weight that lifts when that sentence lands is not relief. It is something heavier. It is the grief of realizing that every apology you offered, every edge you sanded down, every version of yourself you assembled to make the tension stop, was offered to a problem that was never yours. You were pouring water into a hole that had no bottom, and you blamed yourself for the hole. You blamed your directness. You blamed your sensitivity. You blamed the way you noticed things that others seemed content to leave unexamined, and none of it was the cause. The apologies were deposited into an account that did not belong to you, and they earned nothing because the debt was never yours. If they are not reacting to what you did, what exactly is triggering their hostility? To understand that, you have to look at the one biological trait you carry that you have never been able to conceal. You do not perform. That is the simplest way to say it, and it is the thing about you that draws the most consistent, inexplicable punishment. You walk into a room and within seconds, you have registered what is actually happening beneath the social choreography. You see the resentment behind the smile. You sense the manipulation dressed as generosity. You feel the power dynamics that everyone else has silently agreed to ignore. You did not ask for this. It is not a skill you developed. It is the way your nervous system processes information, and it has been operational since childhood. Before you understood what you were seeing, you were already seeing it. Before you had any framework for the tension you felt in certain rooms, your body was already responding to it. You were the child who knew the adults were lying before the sentence was finished. The child who could feel the argument coming 20 minutes before it arrived. And you assumed, because no one told you otherwise, that everyone could feel what you felt. That the information pouring through your nervous system was standard, universal, unremarkable. It was none of those things. Jung described this type with a precision that will unsettle you. The intuitive, he said, does not see the stumbling block before his feet, but he smells a rat for 10 miles. He was speaking in an interview, describing the typology of perception, and what he named was not a gift in any comfortable sense. He named a biological processing speed that bypasses the social surface entirely and arrives at the hidden truth of a situation before the conscious mind has finished registering the room. Your perception does not travel through the normal channels. It does not stop at the persona, evaluate the performance, and then decide whether the performance is credible. It leaps past the entire construction and lands on the raw truth beneath it. Instantaneously, without effort, without your consent. You have felt this. He has felt it in a boardroom, saying nothing, simply observing with accuracy, and watched the person across from him react with sudden defensive hostility as though he had issued a public accusation. She has felt it at a family gathering, keeping quiet, holding her observations inside her chest like swallowed glass, and watched a sibling or parent bristle at her very stillness, as if her silence were an indictment. You thought you were keeping your clarity private. You believed that as long as you did not say the thing you saw, the seeing itself was invisible. It was not invisible. People can feel when they are being seen through. The persona, that assembled mask of social performance that Jung mapped as the individual's compromise with society, requires the unspoken cooperation of everyone in the room to survive. It requires that no one look too closely, that no one register the distance between the mask and the face beneath it. Your perception violates this agreement without your permission, without your intention, and often without your awareness. You did not choose to strip anyone's disguise. You simply walked into the room with eyes that cannot stop functioning, and the person whose mask was thinnest felt the exposure before you said a single word. And the person whose mask you have penetrated does not think. This individual perceives me accurately. They think this individual is dangerous. They cannot name why. They do not have the vocabulary for what just happened. They simply feel exposed suddenly in a space full of people who had agreed not to notice. An exposure, in the economy of the unconscious, is an act of aggression. Your clarity is the crime. Your refusal to participate in the performance is the offense. And the punishment arrives not as a direct confrontation, but as that specific, deniable, low-grade hostility that you have spent your entire life trying to trace to something you said or did. It comes as the unreturned phone call. The subtle exclusion from a gathering you should have been invited to. The shift in body language when you enter a room that was relaxed 30 seconds ago. The strange, sourceless chill that descends between you and a person you have never wronged. A chill so faint that if you named it out loud, they would tell you that you are imagining things. And you have believed them. You have believed them for decades. You accepted the verdict that you were too sensitive, too paranoid, too much, because the alternative required you to consider something your ego was not prepared to hold. You never opened your mouth. You never raised your voice. You simply perceived. And perception, it turns out, was the entire offense. And the way the collective responds to being seen through is not with self-reflection or gratitude. It is with coordinated retaliation. If you have ever been punished for something you did not say out loud, write the word "seen" in the comments. They begin to accuse you of things that make no sense. The colleague who has been quietly undermining people for years calls you manipulative. The family member who has never once examined their own behavior calls you arrogant. The person whose entire social existence is a performance of warmth over resentment calls you cold. You listen to these accusations in genuine bewilderment because the traits they are describing do not belong to you. They belong, with surgical precision, to the accuser. You have felt this. The specific disorienting vertigo of being accused of the exact flaw that defines the person accusing you. The narcissist calling you self-absorbed. The passive-aggressive person accusing you of hostility. The liar questioning your honesty. And you spent years reviewing your own actions, wondering if they were right. Wondering if you were, in fact, the manipulative one, the arrogant one, the cold one, turning their accusation over in your hands like a diagnosis, examining it from every angle, trying to make it fit your actual behavior. It never fit, and it was never supposed to, but you kept trying it on. You kept holding their words up against your own behavior and asking yourself, honestly, with the kind of brutal self-interrogation that the people throwing the accusation have never once applied to themselves, whether the charge was true. The Alchemist's Path was written for exactly this phase. It gives you Jung-based perception training, somatic drills for distinguishing the superego from the authentic voice of the self, and 3 exclusive chapter videos that go deeper than anything on this channel. 236 pages. Downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com. You lost sleep over labels that belonged to someone else. You questioned your own perception, your own motives, your own character, based on testimony delivered by people who had never questioned any of those things in themselves. And the cruelest part is that your willingness to do this, your willingness to take the accusation seriously, is the very quality that made you a target in the first place. The person who would never examine themselves needed someone who always does. And they found you. Jung named this process an ion, with a specificity that reads like a clinical report on your life. It is quite within the bounds of possibility, he wrote, for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature. A person can, with effort and self-honesty, see their ordinary faults, their impatience, their vanity, their capacity for small cruelties, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. The deeper shadow, the material that lives beneath the personal faults, is so terrifying to the average psyche that it cannot be confronted directly. It must be projected, expelled, thrown outward onto the nearest available surface. And you, because your clarity has already dismantled their mask, because your presence has already made them feel the precise thing they have been running from, become the ideal screen for every piece of darkness they refuse to integrate. You are the blank wall they project their own film onto, and then they look at the projection and call it your face. Jung observed what happens next with devastating accuracy. He wrote that the recognition of projections requires a rare self-criticism that the average person will never undertake. Instead, they remain self-righteous and prefer mutual vilification to the recognition of their projections. That is not theory. That is the clinical description of the dynamic you have been living inside for 20 or 30 years. The group does not pause and ask whether the darkness they are seeing in you actually belongs to them. They do not look inward. They look at you, they see the reflection of their own unprocessed material, and they declare, with absolute certainty, that the darkness is yours. They do not hate you. They are not even reacting to you. They are reacting to the parts of their own psyche that your clarity has made temporarily visible, and they are doing what every unindividuated person does when confronted with their own unlived darkness. They project it onto the clearest surface in the room. They call their own shadow by your name. The manipulator calls you manipulative. The person performing warmth calls you cold. The person terrified of their own insignificance calls you arrogant. Every charge they brought against you was autobiography written in the second person, and you, for years, accepted those confessions as your own. You took their shadow home with you and tried it on in the mirror. You studied it. You wondered if it fit. And the reason it tormented you so deeply is that you are the type of person who takes every accusation seriously, who cannot simply dismiss a charge without examining it. Your integrity, the very quality that separates you from the people projecting onto you, is the same quality they exploited. Because they knew without consciously knowing that you would carry what they threw at you, that you would examine it with the same forensic devotion you bring to every relationship, that you would try to make it yours. You were never the perpetrator, you were the screen. And the forensic autopsy you ran on your own behavior was an investigation of evidence that was planted. You were examining fingerprints that were never yours at a crime scene that existed only inside the accuser's psyche. And the reason you could not solve the case is the same reason you could never find the flaw in your behavior. There was no case. There was no flaw. There was only a group of people who needed somewhere to put the parts of themselves they could not face, and you, because you were the clearest surface in the room, received all of it. Year after year, relationship after relationship, the same bewildering pattern, the same inexplicable animosity, the same fruitless search for the mistake you never made. The realization of this dynamic forces you to confront the heaviest reality of the path you are standing on. You cannot soften a mirror enough to make someone like their own reflection. And that means the strategy you have been using your entire life, the shrinking, the accommodating, the sanding down of every edge, was never going to work. It was never designed to work, because the problem it was trying to solve does not live inside you. You spent your entire adult life treating the resentment of others as a verdict on your worth. You built a case against yourself using their evidence. You assumed that if you were hated, you must be guilty, because in the logic of the ego, there is no such thing as punishment without a crime. Jung understood that this logic collapses the moment a person stops participating in the collective agreement. The individual who begins to perceive what the group has decided not to see pays for that perception with the group's hostility, not because the group has evaluated them and found them wanting, because the group cannot tolerate what they represent. There is a passage in Jung's letters where he described why the unconscious appears to people in such a disagreeable form. They are afraid of it, he wrote, and they revile it because they hope that by this method they can free themselves from its attractions. He was writing about the psyche's relationship to its own depths, but the principle operates identically in the social field. You represent the unconscious to the people who resent you. Your depth, your refusal to perform, your quiet capacity to see what is actually happening beneath the surface. These are not personality traits to them. They are threats, reminders of everything they have buried, invitations to a confrontation they have spent their entire lives avoiding. They do not hate you. They hate the part of themselves you make visible by existing, and the distinction between those two sentences contains the entire liberation you have been searching for. One sentence means you are flawed and must correct yourself. The other means you are standing in the path of someone else's avoidance, and no correction in the world will move you out of their way, because your position is not the problem. Their avoidance is the problem, and they will never stop avoiding. And here is what changes when you finally take this in. Not intellectually, not as a concept you can articulate at dinner, but in the body, in the specific place where you have been storing decades of unearned guilt. The apology stops, not dramatically, not with a declaration. It simply ceases to form in your throat the way it used to, automatically, reflexively, before any evaluation of whether an apology was warranted. You feel the old impulse rise, and for the first time, you do not obey it. You let it pass through you the way weather passes through an open field. It arrives, it registers, and it moves on without rearranging you. Not the capacity for genuine accountability. That remains. You are still the person who can look at their own behavior honestly, who can locate a real failing and own it without deflection. That capacity was never the problem. The problem was that you extended it to situations where no failing existed. You apologized for their projections. You corrected for their discomfort. You assembled version after version of yourself to accommodate a coldness that had nothing to do with you, and each version moved you further from the person you actually were. The world asked you to edit yourself into something palatable, and you did it so thoroughly that you forgot what the original draft looked like. You became fluent in the language of self-erasure. You learned to shrink before you were asked, to preemptively remove the parts of yourself that might generate friction, to arrive at every interaction already softened, already adjusted, already less than you actually are. And the people who benefited from that diminishment called it maturity. They called it grace. They called it being easy to be around. And what they meant every single time was that you had successfully made yourself small enough that they did not have to confront what your full presence stirred in them. The quiet hostility that has followed you through every room, every relationship, every family gathering where you could feel the resentment radiating from someone who had never once been wronged by you, was never a verdict on your character. It was the sound of the collective flinching at its own reflection. It was the price of clarity in a world full of people who have built their entire lives around the agreement not to see. You do not need to adjust your tone. You do not need to soften your observations. You do not need to run one more autopsy on a conversation that went wrong, because the conversation did not go wrong. You simply existed in it with your eyes open, and that was more than the room could hold. Jung called the process of becoming psychologically whole individuation, and he never once described it as a path that earns applause. The crowd does not cheer when you stop performing. The herd does not celebrate when you refuse to participate in the shared delusion. They vilify. They project. They accuse you of the precise darkness they are fleeing. And your only task, the only task that has ever actually belonged to you, is to stop mistaking their panic for your verdict. You were never hated for what you did. You were hated because you refused to close your eyes. And the search is over. Not because you found the answer you were looking for, because you finally understood that the question was never yours to carry. The file is closed. The case against you, the one you prosecuted with more rigor than any of your accusers ever brought, returns a single verdict. Not guilty. Not guilty of manipulation. Not guilty of arrogance. Not guilty of the coldness they named in you that was always a description of their own interior weather. Not guilty of being too much, because what they called too much was simply the full measure of a person who had not yet learned to edit themselves down to a size the room could tolerate. The investigation is finished. The only thing left to do is stop apologizing for your sight. If the hostility never made sense to you, if you searched for the crime and found nothing, write this in the comments. The autopsy is closed. Jung-based boundary drills, perception training for empaths, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. 236 pages. Downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com.